All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Hugon. I'm a CS50 TF. This is my fourth year associated with the class, and which is kind of weird, right? Because that would require me having been around for more than 4 years. So I am no longer a Harvard student. I graduated last year, but I'm sticking around and TFing in addition to my full-time job. So it's a pleasure to see you all here, and I hope that jQuery, which is what we're going to be talking about today, will be helpful to you guys in your final projects, and beyond, really. So. A very quick introduction. What is jQuery? Well, I'm going to not even paraphrase. I'm going to tell you verbatim what the site says, jQuery's own site, because I can't really phrase it any better than they have already. It is a fast and concise JavaScript library that simplifies HTML document traversing, event handling, AJAX interactions, animation, and they say rapid web development. That depends how good at it you are. So that's the one caveat that I would say, or condition that I would add. But it's designed to change the way that you write JavaScript, and that much is definitely true. I know because I wrote this entire set of code that I'm going to be showing you guys today this morning, and as I was writing all of the code for the example that we're going to be focusing on today, it occurred to me that it's very, very different in terms of the way that you think about coding a website when you're on a jQuery-based site rather than a, say, PHP and HTML and maybe a tiny bit of JavaScript-based site like you would have done for PSET 7 or maybe even PSET 8 when you were doing the JavaScript stuff for that. So why is jQuery useful? jQuery is useful because it allows you to handle these specific, three of them in particular, these three things which are otherwise very hard or very cryptic and kind of clunky. These three features, I guess, of JavaScript that would otherwise be hard. So those three things being event handling, animation, and AJAX interactions. Document traversal you kind of get as part of that package, but hopefully over the course of looking at the code that we have planned, you'll see why this is so easy and why jQuery is such an awesome tool to use when you're programming a website that's going to be using PHP and JavaScript together. Okay, so jQuery is shiny. Here's the site that we're going to be focusing on today. It's largely a login example to start off with, and then once we figure out how the login is working, we're going to go in and see the actual underlying site, and we're going to look at an example of basically a bunch of examples that are going to use jQuery to make a site dynamic and to do a bunch of fancy things on the page. And we'll be switching back and forth between the implementation, like the actual jQuery code, the index.html or .php that we're using, and the site, looking at it right here. So we're going to kind of be switching back and forth to see what's doing what under the hood. So this, as I said, is the site for those of you who just walked in. We're going to be looking first at a login example. And this login example uses jQuery as opposed to just PHP. Or even a few of you may have implemented some JavaScript when you were doing PSET 7 if you were being overzealous and trying to make things a little flashier than the basic login 1, login 2 PHP sequence. So as you can see, I wrote some stupid text here to reiterate my points, which are that jQuery is going to be slicker, and it's going to look nicer, and it's going to impress your friends much more than a kind of simple PHP-based site and implementation would. So on PHP, if I had more time, I would have assembled a kind of side-by-side example of this site based only in PHP, in which you would have to, as you might recall from PSET 7, you would have a username and a password like this. You'd click submit, and then the page would go white while it's on login 2, very briefly. It would do some calculations. It would figure out if your login worked correctly, and then it would redirect you to index.php or something like that. So you'll note, if you look up at the URL, they're actually already on index.php. It doesn't say so explicitly, but like implicitly, we're on index.php. Here we are. So one thing that you will notice throughout this, and which kind of hints at the power of jQuery, is that throughout this tutorial, we're never going to leave index.php, and we're never going to have to reload the page. So that's cool. And that's one of the things that makes jQuery really neat, is that it'll cut down on the amount of pages that the user sees. And it just ends up being a much more elegant way to lay out your site. So what PHP gives you is the ability to dynamically load pages, whereas what JavaScript gives you is the ability to dynamically rearrange what is on a page once you've loaded the page without going and talking to the server again. What AJAX gives you, this is, again, recap of what you should already know from last week's section, hopefully, depending how far your TF got, is that, so AJAX kind of tries to combine the two. It tries to give you server-side interaction without forcing you to reload your client page. So to reload whatever PHP file you're on or HTML file you're on. So AJAX, as you also might remember, is hard. It's cryptic, it's gross, it's ugly. I've never written a single AJAX request in my entire life. However, I've written many of them using jQuery as a wrapper. And the jQuery method of executing AJAX calls is really, really great, and one of the big reasons to use jQuery. So I'm kind of lingering on this site view, but let's actually go look at the code after we do a quick demo of what the site is doing right now. So let's start by logging in. So I'm going to log in as Alex, and my password is going to be something. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So that login is going to be rejected. This used to be a Harry Potter-based example, and I switched it all around at the last second, and I clearly forgot to change the error text. But, but what it would be doing is grabbing whatever you typed in as your username. You noticed, hopefully, that I just clicked back in that box, and the error message immediately went away. We haven't reloaded the page at all throughout that submit button, throughout me typing anything. So again, I'm going to say, let's say Bob. And Bob's password is, again, some random stuff. I'm going to press enter. Actually, let's just press submit. You'll notice the way to make sure that I'm not cheating and that we're not reloading the page is to check and make sure that actually I don't remember what it is. I think, see the little Earth icon next to jQuery is shiny? So in my browser tab, make sure that that doesn't change or rotate at all. It does not. So the page is not reloading. So the neat thing about this is now it's clearly figuring out what my name is, and it's dynamically changing the page as I interact with the page. So up here, that's where you can look to make sure that the browser is not sending another request, communicating with the server. So we're going to try to avoid communicating with the server in a way that the user perceives, because what that basically translates to is a slicker and cooler web experience, and that the user's like, oh wow, look at all this stuff, and the page is never reloading. Maybe it's just me, but but I think it's cool that jQuery allows you to do this, and that's what AJAX is all about. It's letting you talk to the server while staying on the same page. So again, I'm going to click back on username. The error message is going to go away. Actually, let's just click on password. So both of them have that characteristic, in that if I go back to try logging in again, presumably, the behavior associated with that event, we're going to talk about events. One thing that seems associated with that event is that I make the error message go away. So OK, let's log in as Harry Potter. OK, so the web, or rather the page didn't reload. You can trust me on that one. Hogwarts, forgot to change that too. So we say, well done, you logged in successfully, and welcome to Hogwarts. OK, so I'm just going to disclaim this one. The one page reload that I do have in this entire example is if you log out, because I was too lazy to go and actually implement it as a jQuery call. So if we do log out, if you look up at that jQuery shiny tab, it is going to think there for a second and kind of reset everything for me. But that's the only time that the website does reload. So OK, here we are. Well, welcome, well done, welcome to Hogwarts, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to log out for the rest of the time because you've seen what it does. Though we will look at the code briefly. So here we appear to have some kind of comment system. So again, the general approach of this is I'm going to show you everything once, and then we're going to go look at what the code is doing, and then we'll kind of come back and switch back and forth to show you step by step how things are going. So there's a name, and there's a comment. So it's just a message board. If I click, the text that is already there, kind of pre-populated, goes away. If I click out, it comes back. If I click here, it goes away. If I click there, it comes back. This is kind of behavior that you take for granted on any sophisticated, halfway sophisticated site that you visit on the web today. And it's just basic JavaScript, but hopefully having done some web coding yourselves now, you can appreciate that there is actually some code that's underlying this behavior. And it's not always super trivial when you're working on your first PHP site to make behavior like that happen. So OK, let's leave a comment. I'm Alex, and I'm a troll, so I'm going to make a first post. So let's actually not leave anything. And let's say add comment. And so we've got an alert, which hopefully many of you implemented in your pset8s or something like that in your pset8s. So just a simple HTML alert. Hopefully it won't actually send a request. So it leaves Alex there. It's waiting for me to correct my mistake. And so I can say, OK, fine, here's a valid comment. Let's add the comment. Woo! No page reload, but there's my comment. So we have a simple little comment class that gets generated when I submit this form. It is a form, as we'll see. And we say the name of the person, followed by wrote, followed by some formatting. Oh my gosh, I clicked and it went away. I forgot about that feature. That's how you delete a comment, as it turns out. That's going to make highlighting difficult. I didn't even think about that. Let's leave another comment. Here's our comment back. I'll try not to highlight this time. So as you can imagine, I mean, hopefully, having done the coding that you guys have already done, you can imagine what PHP is going on in the background to make this happen. So I'm submitting a form. It's doing an insert into request. And then some magic is happening to actually make the contents of my submission show up here. So we see Alex wrote, followed by my comment in double quotes, followed by moments ago, ... If I refresh, we see Alex wrote another comment, and then we see the timestamp of when I actually did submit that. So right now it is 2:15, and as you can see, the timestamp there is 2:15. So had I waited another couple of minutes and then refreshed, it would have corresponded with my original submission of that comment. It's not when I refresh that the timestamp is associated with. It's when I actually pressed submit. So let's add another one. And again, we see this portion of our page is expanding dynamically. So we could keep doing this for a while, but instead let's show off that functionality that I accidentally already showcased, which is the ability to delete one of these. So totally unintuitively, if you click on one of these, it goes away forever. So let's do that on this one first. Woo! That was some pretty fancy animation, wasn't it? Yes, yes. Yeah, it was. I see some nods. Good. So that's that third part of jQuery that's really awesome. So we've already seen so far no page reloading, so that's Ajax for you. We've seen animation now. We've seen event handling when I'm clicking on these various boxes and things are happening behind the scenes. So like this is what I mean, event handling. On focus, loss of focus, on click, things like that. So we're going to see all of that in code shortly. But that's basically all of the functionality that this site offers right now. And I don't think we're going to add any more over the course of this example unless we go very fast through the code. But you can trust me that there's plenty of code to look at that actually makes this work correctly. So let's add one more just for kicks. You'll notice that when I tabbed into the box, it doesn't reset the code, or it doesn't consider it a focus event. Good question. We'll see. So I tab in, and it doesn't become blank and wait for me to type, which is, one could argue that that's not really desired behavior, and that if I were to fully flesh this out and make it as user-friendly as I would like it to be, that should be the correct behavior, that I should be able to tab in and have it consider that a focus event. Let's quickly look at the underlying representation of this in a database before we switch the code, so that when I reference certain fields and things in our table, you'll know what they are. So the whole site is powered by just this one table, comments. And as you can see, comments has one entry in it right now. It's been auto-incrementing based on comment ID, comment ID. So we've added 3 so far. This happens to be the third one. We might have added 4, but we deleted number 4. So currently, this is the only comment in the system. It's got the comment itself, the self-reported name of the commenter, which you might associate with a name associated with an account if we had a real login going on. And then a comment ID, which is just unique and auto-incrementing. And we have a timestamp, which, if I were to show you the schema, the timestamp is actually nothing that I do via code. It's just the automatic behavior for a timestamp if you set the defaults to be current timestamp when you're assembling your table in PHP-MyAdmin. So nothing unexpected here. Before we dive into the code, are there any questions about anything you've seen? Many of which I will hopefully be able to say, we'll wait 2 seconds and look at the code. We're good? Question? Can you repeat more than all the functionalities we're talking about? For jQuery? Yes. So the question was, can I repeat one more time all of the functionality that one is going to benefit from by using jQuery to implement your site. So right here on jQuery's homepage, it does a better job than I can of summing that up. So it is a fast and concise JavaScript library. That much I'll show you in a second. The fast part I have no real experience with. I haven't really compared it to anything else, but I assume it's fast. It is certainly a concise JavaScript library, and it makes it much easier to, as far as we're concerned, to handle events. So that's when I click on something and something else happens without actually sending a server request. It facilitates events and event handling. It makes it really intuitive to animate your page. And we have limited animation capabilities in this app. It's basically just the sliding up and the sliding down of various things on the page. But there is much more that you can do simply with jQuery with regard to animation. And then AJAX interactions are when you do actually want to send a server-side post or GET request to communicate with the database. It allows you to do that without actually reloading your current page in your browser, which is, it lets you make AJAX requests. And it makes it really easy. So that is a big plus. So here, getting back to the concise part that jQuery boasts, or the fact that it is concise, this is all of jQuery, the entire language, all in this one .js file. So it's a little deceptive that it's only these 3 lines, because as you can see, it actually is pretty long. But the functions and the functionality that I will be using in all of the jQuery functions that you'll be seeing are defined in this one file. So that's a huge plus, is that perhaps many of you have been dabbling in various other APIs like Google Maps or Google Earth, and you've been thinking, oh my gosh, like, how do I even start? Where do I drop these files? Do I drop these files somewhere? Do I link to them somehow? What do I do to get access to this functionality? Well, with jQuery, it can't be much easier. You go to the jQuery site right here, and you say, grab the latest version, you download it, and it'll give you several different options of how to download it in terms of how compressed the file is. But basically, if you get a minified JS, meaning they've made the file size smaller by cutting out the white space in the file and just compressing it all to look like this, because the computer doesn't need white space, it's just humans that need it. If you download this minified version of jQuery, then you just dump this JavaScript file in your directory of whatever website you're programming, and you have access to all the files. Well, you are ready to have access to all the files. So once you've dumped this jQuery-version.js file or .min.js file, if you get a minified version, once you dump that in your working directory, so in this case, here's my entire website, right? It's all living in this one directory. So I dropped jQuery in it right here. And then, in order to actually gain access to that folder, you just do something which you have already all done, or at least have seen done in pset 8, so in the shuttle. So here on my one user visible PHP page, I link to the jQuery library as a JavaScript script file. So again, nothing new here really. This is something that you had in pset 8 already. So you're simply linking in the .js file, and you gain access to all the functionality that's contained in that file. Any questions about how to install jQuery? That is how you install jQuery. You put the file somewhere, and then specify the path to that file in a script external link. Great, OK. The other thing that you can see that I've included is my own helpers.js JavaScript file, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today. So that's where I actually, as you will see, define most of my write most of my jQuery code. Because this page is pretty empty. So this is my index.php, the one page that you guys already saw, and that powers the entire site and all of the behavior that you just witnessed. As you can see, there's nothing on this page. It's simply some skeletons of divs. So I've got something that may begin to make a little bit of sense if you remember very well what the site looked like, but basically it looks like I've got a debug div up there, which I don't think I ever used in this example, but which I just copy-pasted from some other site that I had done. I've got my header, which is where I put that picture of Scott Crouch and I epically dueling in preparation for the CS50 fair. I guess I didn't explain that yet. Never mind. And then for content, I've got a bunch of different things. And content is basically the central box that has the interesting parts of the site. So under that picture, that header picture. And it looks like we've got, so content is, again, that big part of the site. And inside of it, I'm going to have welcome. And this is actually in not chronological, but in top-down order. So welcome is going to sit on top. there's going to be an error and a login div beneath that. Then there's a page div. And then under content is a footer, which appears to just have that copyright information that I just have there for no good reason. So I have no PHP code, right? I don't see any PHP code except for this one line at the top, which simply requires a common.php file, which takes care of the MySQL connection for us, just like your own common.php file did in pset 7. 7? Yeah, 7. So we're not even going to look at that because it has my database password information, and I don't want that to get stolen. But it simply makes sure that you're logged in for certain pages and handles that redirection to log in if you haven't logged in. So nothing really exciting there. So where's all my code, right? So I've already told you it's in helpers.js. So we can go there next. I'm going to close jQuery for screen space reasons. But basically, the entire site is powered by this central JavaScript file, which itself is using jQuery functions defined in the jQuery library, which I've included. That's that .js file. And by calling those functions, or in calling those functions, I refer to other PHP files. So the site is not without its PHP. It's just that it's hidden from the user as far as that one index kind of central repository page is concerned. So the PHP will happen and is necessary in order to execute those AJAX requests. I mean, AJAX requests are about talking to the server, and PHP is what you use to talk to the server for the purposes of CS50 at least, or CS50 thus far. So we'll see the PHP, but it's not used as explicitly as you might otherwise have thought it was going to be in your other PHP files. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, it will soon. Are there any questions right now? Okay, again, just holler out or raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, so here's our file. There are a few things that you have probably already noticed and that you might be thinking, oh, this must just be JavaScript because I haven't done that much JavaScript and I don't actually know what JavaScript is versus jQuery. So I'll try not to ignore that limitation, and I'll try to point out when something is JavaScript versus when something is jQuery, because the reality is jQuery is just a JavaScript library, and it happens to have a bunch of its own notation, which makes it look like an entirely different programming language, but the reality is that you can intersperse normal JavaScript with jQuery calls basically interchangeably, and it works no problem. It's just JavaScript. So I will try to point out when something's jQuery versus JavaScript, but the main way to know that you should be aware of like right now is that if you see a $sign in front of it, it's probably jQuery. Anything that doesn't have a $sign in front of it, I'm probably about to take this back. No, maybe, I actually think maybe that's true. So anything without a $sign in front of it is probably normal JavaScript. And stop me if you see an exception to that, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so this $document.ready function, what is this? So we're basically just going to start from the top of the file, go to the end of the file, and then we'll be switching back and forth between the site itself and the behavior that we're defining here. So document.ready, and then we have a function, it seems, which looks kind of random and weird, and then we've got some code, and then we've got this, which appears to, if you actually follow the syntax, it appears to end that function. So using our nice highlight capabilities, we see that that curly bracket for that function that we're declaring on the fly corresponds to this one down here. And this parenthesis after it is the end of the ready call, the call to the ready function. So forgive the notation. That's just the way. I'm being told that we can't see it very well. Is that any better? Okay. So again, we have something called the document, which is having a ready function called off of it, and then the argument that's being given to the ready function is this that I have highlighted. And my apologies that the highlight is a little hard to see in terms of contrast, but basically everything up to that last parenthesis. And the parenthesis defines the end of that function call, nothing that you haven't seen before, and then semicolon because we put semicolons at the end of our lines of code. So what is this doing? Many of you have probably already been figuring this out as I've been talking, but basically, and this is not really easy, maybe it is easy to describe. When in JavaScript you would have referred to a part of your, like on the DOM for your file, of your HTML or PHP file, when you might have referred to a tag using document.getElementById, the ID itself, dot some part of that tag. So like inner HTML, something you might have used doing your announcements for PSET 8, right? We never have to do that anymore here. We have a different way of getting access to tags on our page. That's the HTML traversal that jQuery likes to pride itself on. So what this is saying is basically, hey, you, the document. So when we say $, and format something this way with parentheses after the $, it's saying we're going to be grabbing a certain part of the page. In this case, it's the whole page, because it's just document. I don't think you'll actually ever see document again on this entire page. But this is something that you don't actually have to have in your site, but in this case, it makes sense. Basically, what this says is execute this code every time we load the site, or the page, sorry, that this JavaScript file is being linked to. So we're saying, OK, document, when you are done loading, or as part of your loading, that's what this ready is saying, execute this function, which is an anonymous function. It doesn't have a name or anything. Like your other JavaScript functions might be, function, do something, parenthesis, parenthesis, and then have a bunch of behavior, and might need to be called. This one gets called by loading the page. And we don't have a name for it. It's just kind of this anonymous function, which is what happens when I load this page for the first time without clicking anything or doing anything. So what is going on here? Again, I told you that when you have a $ followed by parentheses with stuff in the parentheses, that's how it's traversing the page and getting access to various parts of it via a tag or an ID or something like that. So in this case, we're going to be seeing a lot of this. Can anyone wager a guess of what this grabs on the page? Yes. So the answer is a div, which happens to have the ID of error. So I'm saying, what kind of tag am I looking for? And then by specifying a $, I'm saying with an ID of. And if you've done CSS, that'll make a little more sense why it's set up that way. But it's designed to be intuitive, matching up with CSS. But basically, I'm saying, give me the div that has the ID of error. So this that I have highlighted now, so $, parenthesis, div, pound, error, that is an object. And it's represented as an object, which now I can call methods off of to manipulate that object. If you've done any Java coding in your time, this should be intuitive. If you didn't really think about objects that hard in PSET 8, then this might not make a lot of sense. But basically, I'm grabbing this part of my page and then having an abstraction for that thing on the page, and then calling methods off of that thing on the page to mess with that thing on the page. That's object-oriented for you, object-oriented programming for you in a one very poorly presented sentence. OK, so what are we doing with this error div? We are doing .css, and then we're supplying arguments of display, comma, none. Can anyone guess what this is doing? OK, I won't have awkward silences. So what this is doing is it's setting the CSS for this thing on my page, for this tag, and it's setting the style for, like the CSS style for this one element, the display property, to none. Basically, I'm making this invisible. No one can see this right now after this line of code has executed. So just as kind of a crash course, I'm going to write a line of code that does something slightly different, but which is going to be important to understand the difference when we're looking at other pieces of jQuery and understanding the jQuery language in general. So this line sets the display to none. So how might you get the display for the div error part of the page? Well, it would be CSS, so same function. So this is a little weird, regardless of what programming language you're coming from. But we use the same function to both get and set. And the way that we specify whether we're trying to get or set a value associated with whatever we're doing is through the arguments themselves. So this is a little strange, but this gets the value of display on div error. So does that make sense to everyone? Again, it's a little strange because you would think that a function would do the same thing, more or less, regardless of what arguments it has. But in this case, this is kind of an underlying fact of the jQuery language. is that if you supply, basically the jQuery language has a bunch of pair situations when you're setting things in which you specify, okay, for CSS, I want to specify this thing for CSS to have this value. But if you just ask for the CSS of display, it'll tell you the CSS of display. So if you're reading it kind of in English, it makes sense. But otherwise, if you try to think about it too hard and just look at the arguments, it doesn't make so much sense. So again, just to reiterate, in case I haven't beaten this to death enough, we're saying, okay, for this object, we're going to be doing something with the CSS, and it looks like we're going to have display set to none. Here, we have this div error. We're going to be doing something with the CSS. I'm asking for display because I'm not telling it a display. So what this represents is the display, and I could do something with this value that I now have if I wanted to. So I could say something like var disp equals that. So that's like an expression of code on the right-hand side of the equal sign. It's evaluating to some value, which I'm then going to store as a variable and be able to access later in my program. I'm not sure why I might want to do that. Maybe I was going to use this as a temporary variable and be messing around with CSS in different ways. I can't imagine many situations that you would encounter in which you'd want to do something like this, but this was really more than anything else to illustrate the fact that the number of arguments does matter in terms of defining set versus get functionality. Make sense? Cool. We're now going to get rid of this because it would otherwise break all my code, I'm sure. jQuery is fragile. So, okay. We appear to be setting the CSS display to none on this error div. And then we're doing this. So this is, again, one of the one of the integral parts of jQuery. This is an AJAX request. So it might look alien to you right now, but I assure you that if you were to look at a normal AJAX request, it would look way, way better. Normal AJAX requests are really gross, and you have to set up an envelope and then send the envelope to some URL and like wait for something back, and it's kind of ugly. Whereas this, we are sending it looks like a GET request. So this is the same GET that you think of when you're doing an HTML form and you say, okay, method equals GET versus method equals post. So similarly, there's something in jQuery called $.post. And then there's stuff, and you can send a post as easily as that. So that's actually going to be going to some PHP page somewhere that you would specify, doing whatever is on that PHP page, and then possibly coming back and giving you like some result that PHP may have evaluated to. So in this case, what we're doing, and well, I guess I'll get there. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, go to getislogged.php, which we have right here, and which I'll show you in a second. Execute all of the code on getislogged.php without actually leaving this page. Do this asynchronously in the background. So go to that page, do whatever that page tells you to do, and then it looks like by specifying this as an argument afterwards, I'm having another anonymous function. These are kind of a key part to jQuery as well, anonymous functions. I'm basically specifying a handler right here for, and if it gives you something back, so if getislogged.php gives you something back, receive that back as data, and then we can then respond in a certain way based on whatever it told us. So in this case, now hopefully it makes sense what this is doing. It's going to getislogged, which now hopefully intuitively you'll know to be asking whether or not the user is logged in. And then based on whatever it decides and then tells us back via an echo, as we'll see, we're going to take whatever it gives us back as data. So whatever it gives us back is this argument to the function, which is a little strange, like notation-wise, but that's how it works. So this function is going to give us back data. Or rather, this is going to give us back data, and then function is going to say, what do I do with that data? Cool? And well, what do we do with that data? If data is 0, I'm going to be doing something which is just a JavaScript function that I wrote called login, and otherwise I'm going to say load the page. So the logic here is, if getislogged gives me back a 0, they're not logged in. I want to make them log in again. Or I want to like show the login screen that we've already seen. And then otherwise, if it gives me back anything other than 0, I'm going to assume that they are successfully logged in, maybe by a session variable, maybe by some other way. However, I am keeping an underlying representation of whether or not they're logged in. I'm going to then load the page, which is basically everything else apart from the login stuff that you saw. So once I pressed submit with Harry Potter as my credentials, we had that whole comment thing going on. this is what's going to trigger the whole comment thing getting loaded on my page. We had a question?
Yeah, the function with the data being passed in?
Yes.
Is that another anonymous function?
This one right here?
Yeah.
So the question is this another anonymous function? Yes. Any function that doesn't have a signature that looks kind of like this is an anonymous function, aka any function that I specify kind of on the fly in some other function call without giving it an explicit name is an anonymous function. There's probably another term for it too that I'm forgetting, but sorry?
Lambda function.
Yes, lambda function. That's another way of saying it, yeah. Another question.
Does the file getislog.php return something specifically called data, or could you replace data there with anything?
You can replace data there with anything. Sorry, I'll repeat the question. Does this getislog.php function, does it return something that is specifically associated with what I called the argument to the anonymous function? So in this case, data. The answer is no. It'll return something, and then I get to specify what I call that something for the purposes of my function. It's really just like in C, or I won't say in JavaScript. It's just like in C, when you call swap, right? Everyone remember int swap? So, or void swap when you're using pointers. So when I call swap on x, y, when I then define the behavior of my swap function, I can call those variables that are coming in int x, y. Or sorry, did I say that already? If it's x, y up here when I'm calling swap, I can call them a, b down there. Same thing here. It will come as some value, and I will treat that value as data, just because I feel like it, and because it makes sense to me that that's the data that I'm getting back from getislog.php. Yes, another question.
And that's just like based on the parameters of like the jQuery function .get or whatever, like that's just how.
So the question is basically how do these parameters work and how do I know what I'm doing here? So there are several different ways that you can set up a GET or a POST request, and you'll see various examples of that over the course of this file. But some basic ones, and I guess I could write this down somewhere, but with a GET request, with a GET request, it makes sense that you're going to have these two, right? You need to specify which file you want to go get something from, or what file is going to define the GET that I want to do. And then, given what it got for me, what do I do with that for this page, right? So you can treat this as, if I were logging in, this could be like my login to, and then it would redirect me right back to this page for index, and based on whatever it gave me, like whatever I have in my get parameters or something, or rather, no. This is the event handling, this is the like, once I get something back from that asynchronous, so AJAX server request, this is what I do with that information. So gets are usually just going to look like this. I can't actually think if there's another way to set up a get, but basically you're going to ask the server something, and then based on what it tells you back, do something with that. A post is slightly different, right? So post, there are several different ways that you can do it. Because for a post, that means I need to tell the server something. So here, we didn't tell the server anything. We didn't give it any arguments in like the get array, for example. Oh, so I lied. I'll get back and correct my lie in a second. So here, we didn't tell the get anything. And I'll just go to the page real quick to show you what's going on, right? So what getislog is doing, which hopefully makes sense given what we just saw on that .js screen, is it's either going to give me back a 0 or a 1. And it happens to be doing this JSON encode bit. We'll talk about that later. But that's my way of sharing that with like the world, of then like printing out some value, or printing out, generating this string or this value somewhere that someone else is listening to catch it. So whatever I'm echoing is going to be caught as data, that data variable. So that's how you should think about that connection. But basically, I'm just saying, OK, I have either a 0 or a 1 based on whether or not they're logged in. And then I'm going to echo that 0 or 1 encoded as a JSON object. And if you don't know much about JSON, you can read up on that on your own later. But it's a way of me formatting nested or like array-based information. Because sometimes you're not just passing a 0 or a 1. Sometimes you're passing an entire row from your SQL table, or hundreds of rows from your SQL table. And you need to have a nice kind of standardized way of reading that data. We have a question?
Yeah, so when you're using the get function, that means you're getting the return value of whatever's in like .php. Because like, so you're not just like getting everything. There's a lot of stuff there, so it's never going to be 0.
Okay, I'm not sure how to rephrase that question for the camera, but basically, I think the question boils down to what is this file doing? And
It's like when you use like $.get, like how does it know what to get inside of it?
okay, so the question is, how do I know what $.get is going to give me back based on what's in the PHP file that it's linking to, right? Okay, that's a fair question. So what it's doing is it's going to just run this PHP file, and then in that PHP file, I would specify what's going to get returned. So it's going to execute a bunch of code, but none of this code is talking back to like the JavaScript that called it. The only thing that's going to basically talk back is when I do this, basically like a printf, but to the page.
Wait, so if you didn't do echo, then you wouldn't get anything?
Correct. So the follow-up comment was, if I didn't do an echo, I wouldn't get anything. Well, this page would do something. Like, this code would execute, but if I didn't have this, then data would be null, because nothing would be communicated back for it to catch, for the JavaScript to catch. Make sense now? Okay, cool. So what we echo is what we define to be the data we're passing back of our get call or of our post call. So again, I think I was talking about the post call. So for a get, we could have something like this. I'll write another few versions of this. Let's say that I wanted to call get is logged, and I also had more than one user because I had a users table. You'll notice there's no users table for me right now. I just hard-coded it so that Harry Potter is the only way to log in. So it's not actually doing a SQL query here. But if it were like your CS50 Finance and you're trying to log in, this would require a SQL query where I would have to say, is the username and the password matching up to some table or some row in my users table, right? So I didn't bother with any of that because you all know how to do that by now. But you might have to do that. And how would I tell, well, how would I tell this file what is in the username and password field of my form, right? Through the get array, if you're doing traditional PHP. Well, it turns out that if you're doing it this way, you also use the get array. So if I wanted to pass the PHP file some stuff, either to access in the get or post arrays, it might look like this. Again, a different number of arguments. And then here's where I might say the user will get the value of, in this case, I don't have something to pass it, but let's say like Harry, and then pass might be Potter, and I'm going to explain this in a second. So that'll be my second argument instead of the function, and then my third argument would be the function. The documentation for jQuery will tell you of all of these, like different combinations of arguments, and will make it much clearer than this will, but basically the function goes at the end. You specify the function as the last argument, and you specify the file as the first argument, and if there is one in between, it's going to be this, which is what am I passing in the get array. So hopefully this is where things click. So if I want to pass something in the get array, this is going to say, as the key for the get, it's going to be user, and as the value that I'm going to pass, it's going to be Harry. Pass is going to exist in my get array, and it's going to map to Potter as a value. So to get what I just passed in this get request that's getting sent to the server, up here I would have to do something like username equals, here's where I actually get it from the get array, user. This would be Harry. Does this make sense to everyone? Password might be in the get array, pass. This would be Potter. Okay? So I'm getting something from the get array in this PHP file, but the only way that I would have put something in the get array is like this. Specifically, like this. So I specify what's going to get put in the get array, what pairings are going to get put in the get array. There's going to be a user. This is totally arbitrary, by the way. I could have called this anything, like this anything, so long as it corresponds with what I put right here. Make sense? Okay, so in this case, I'm just asking get are they logged in, and I don't need to worry about anything that they typed because I happen to be checking somewhere else explicitly that it's Harry and Potter. I'm not doing any kind of lookup. So I'm just checking whether or not the place that I checked, Harry and Potter, it would have set session user to something. So you don't have to worry about like this so much, but basically this is just saying, are they logged in or are they not logged in? Did they type in the correct combination or not? If they had, this would have gotten set somewhere else at some other file that I'm not showing you right now. And so I'm just making sure that this is set, that their login was successful. And if it was, then I set this logged to 1, and I tell the server back, yes, like 1, or I tell the server back 0. And based on that yes or 0, I do different things on my HTML or on my PHP page. Okay? Questions right now? Big picture, small picture? Yeah.
So it seems like, so I'm a little confused because it seems like maybe like you're setting the user carry and you're setting Pattern and Potter, and then in the next file, you set it and then you get it back.
So the one that I'm not showing you right now, which is kind of an interim step, which is important because I'm skipping what you would normally do. Here in login.php is where I'm actually handling the login. And so based on the things in the field, let me see if I actually can figure out where I do this. I think, so actually we haven't even gotten there yet. So what this translates to is this is kind of not the first thing that the file, this is the first thing the file needs to check every time that it loads, but before we even let them log in, this is happening. For the first time, this is happening. So like, if they haven't logged in yet, then it's going to say login. And here in this login file, or function, this is where I send a post to login.php to actually see if they successfully log in when they click submit on the login form. So like, it's kind of not recursive, but it's kind of like backwards order-wise to look at this first. But does it make sense now? Like the
When you're saying user Harry, what is that? What are you actually saying?
So right here, this is meaningless, but because here I'm not. Sorry. Oh, sorry. So to repeat the question, when right here I'm saying user Harry and pass Potter, the question is, what is that doing? So what that's doing is that's putting entries in the get array, quite simply. I can use them or I cannot use them at the destination of this GET request, the destination being specified by this PHP file. So what I'm saying is, go talk to this PHP file, take the following bits of information with you, because it's a GET request, so put them in the GET array so that it can access them later. And so then we arrive here. We happen to be, this is not, well, yeah, we would be listening for whatever they specified as user, whatever they specified as pass, and then we can do things with those variables. In this case, we're not doing anything with them, right? Username and password never appear again, because I just added them just now to illustrate like the two different ways to get. But we would do something with whatever's in the get array, which we can access like that, and then we could echo something back, something totally unrelated, or something like we could echo back the name that they had, or we could echo back their ID if we just inserted an ID into the table, or something, anything. You can echo back anything, so long as you are listening to that anything and doing something accordingly with that anything. So the anything corresponds to data. So when I echo back a 0 or a 1, I make sure that my anonymous function or my Lambda function is behaving for both a 0 and for a 1. Cool. OK, let's move on from here because, wait, oh my gosh, is it actually 2:50? OK, we're going to go more than an hour. So I'll skim. I will give you guys this entire file and like the whole website itself for you to mess with and copy paste from. So just don't tell your TFs. So basically, if they are logged in, we're going to say, OK, if they are logged in, which is the else, then we're going to load the page. If they're not logged in, we're going to do something called login. So what does this translate to? We have a login function. So it turns out that jQuery doesn't really nicely support forms and tables, which are kind of important parts of HTML. Luckily, you can hack it by just setting the HTML. So in this case, we're doing .html, and then we're providing an argument. So in this case, it's not a pairing like CSS, where you'd say CSS display none. In this case, when you say .html, you're just either going to tell it what the HTML should be, or you're going to ask for what the HTML is without giving an argument. Excuse me. So in this case, I'm saying, OK, get the login div, and set the HTML of that login div, because we're providing an argument, to this whole thing. So this is my whole HTML form, just written in one long string, because I didn't feel like figuring out the jQuery for it. But we're setting the HTML to that. If I wanted to get the HTML for the login div, it would be like this. Div login, HTML, and no argument. And that expression represents the current HTML of that div. Cool? So by putting something in here, I am now setting it to nothing, to an empty string. By putting something here, I'm setting the HTML of that div to now be hello. So hopefully that makes sense that here I'm setting the login div to contain a form and all of its guts. Make sense? Cool. So that's how jQuery works generally. You grab a div and then you manipulate the div. Or you grab the input on a form, you manipulate the input. Stuff like that. So it's not like, I guess the way that you would think about it in normal JavaScript is that you would say document.getElementById login dot whatever the corresponding JavaScript would be to grab the HTML, so inner HTML, and you might have to set that to this whole string. In this case, this doesn't seem particularly advantageous as an alternative, but for many of the other jQuery functions out there, and for different kinds of tags on the page, the alternative using normal JavaScript is really, really gross, and the jQuery is really, really efficient and nice. For instance, sliding up, sliding down. Turns out in jQuery, I'm just going to go somewhere else. In jQuery, when you want something to slide up, you grab the div, for example, page div. So that's my div pound page. And I would say dot slide down, and then I would tell it to slide down either slowly or fast, slow, fast as my argument. Again, that's something that is documented and you can just look up. If you do a Google search for jQuery slide down, it'll tell you how it works. The jQuery API is like really well documented and very easy to read and follow. This will make it slide down, aka go from having a display of none to sliding down and showing up and being there. Okay, so it's as easy as that. Whereas if you actually go into the jQuery.61 whatever, like a 1.6 min.js file to see what does slide down actually do, it's going to be pretty ugly. It's written in the normal JavaScript for what you'd have to do if you want to slide down. So you can see what this is actually saving you from having to do. But animation in particular, animation, AJAX requests, and event handling, as you'll see, are all really intuitive to think about given the jQuery notation for those functionalities. And the normal JS would be hard and ugly. So that's what jQuery is for. Okay, let's look quickly over this page to see what these things do. So just kind of from a high level, and if there are implementation details, then or like detailed questions, I can answer those as we go, but I don't want to go too far over like an hour. Yes, question?
I was just wondering for the page div thing, how exactly do you know what that's referring to in the system?
So the page div, I actually defined it somewhere above there, but I'll just write the definition line again. So it's as easy as this. I would say, give me a JavaScript variable. All of these are JavaScript variables. And I would say, it's going to be a jQuery variable, so I can say var page div, that's going to be my name for it, equals, I do the $sign because I'm writing a jQuery request. And I'm saying, okay, it's going to be, and this is just how you would write it. You would say, give me a div with the ID of whatever, in this case, page, because I know that I have a div called page. If it were a div called error, I would write error right there. But I would say page, done. And that stores as a JavaScript variable the representation of that div as far as JavaScript knows what it is. So the document.getElementById page. So document.getElementById page looks like this in jQuery. Okay? And then we store that as a variable, which is a little strange to think about, but we don't have to give it a type or anything like that. It just knows that it is this thing, this object. And then we say, okay, this object, you slide down, and you slide down slowly. It's as easy as that. These 3 lines, or 2 lines actually, will grab a div and make it slide down. So you might be asking, okay, well, you seem to be making things. Like if you look back at the guts of index.php, there is content, there's welcome, there's error, there's login, there's page, but there also seem to be a bunch of comments that you were generating as you added things, as you used the form to make new comments. So what are each of these? Well, turns out I made a div for each of those. I'm making divs on the fly. But how do I dynamically make these divs? Well, jQuery makes it really easy. So this is the next kind of the next logical step in terms of thinking about jQuery. We've gone over how to traverse the HTML, but we haven't really talked about how to manipulate it and like make new parts of the HTML, to add things to the DOM, to remove things from the DOM. This does it, but doesn't show us how. So this is actually like making something show up on the DOM. But we haven't talked about how to actually how to actually add something to the DOM. So let's find some code where we're doing that. I'm going to skip over this form, but assuming that we understand, actually no, let's start at login. I'll go from the top. So okay, hopefully this intuitively begins to make sense, what these lines of code are doing, jQuery code. So I'm saying store it as user. So in my JavaScript object or variable called user, store it as an object which corresponds to the div username, or actually to the thing that has an ID of username. I could have explicitly told it that it's an input, but I just didn't. It knows what to do. So I'm just saying get the thing on the page that has an ID of username, and then I'm saying select it. So what that does is it pre-selects that field as the thing that is selected with your cursor blinking on it on the page. Easily as that. So when you log on to like bankofamerica.com or something like that, and the cursor is already blinking there for you in the login page, because it knows that you're going to log in as the next thing that you do, that's how you do that. So that's just kind of an aesthetic little addition that I'm adding like that. So then I'm saying, okay, the password field is represented as the document.getElementById password, and then the submit button I'm also storing as a JavaScript variable. So then I'm having some event handling. So this is basic event handling for you. Again, we're using these anonymous or Lambda functions to do that, in which you define the functionality for catching an event. So remember in Scratch, you say, like broadcast something, and then you say when I get something to hear what they broadcast elsewhere in your Scratch code. The equivalent for jQuery looks like this. So what this is saying is when whatever variable user corresponds to, so in this case, the username input field, that string of text that I can type into, when that gets clicked on, do the following. And so I specify the do the following to be make the error div go away. So remember, that's what this site is doing when I log out and when I go. So as we can see, we had that user.select, so our cursor is already blinking in the user box. If I do an incorrect login, when I now click, so when I focus, the error div goes away. Its display gets set to none. And that's the behavior that I'm implementing right here. I'm saying grab the error div, set the CSS to have display none when you receive the event of gaining focus on this thing of the page. Make sense? And I mean, basically you can do anything that there's a jQuery function or event handler for, basically anything you can think of in terms of interacting with the website, there is a jQuery event handler function for, and you can specify your own custom behavior off of that. So you can put whatever you want in this function. It could be anything. I could, when you focus on that, I could start an endless stream of pop-ups on your page, or I could redirect you to some YouTube video, or whatever that there's JavaScript code for or jQuery script for, you can do based off of these events. Okay, so we're doing something similar with passwords. Here we're doing submit.click. So submit is a button on the page, and here I'm specifying the behavior for when I click that button. So instead of letting the HTML form dictate that and lead to some PHP page, I'm saying do this stuff. So by this stuff, it looks like I'm sending a post request. So this will look like the GET request example that I showed you guys earlier, in that I'm saying, okay, go to login.php when I click this button, and then send username in the post array, that, and as password in the post array, that. So user.val gives me the value in the user text box on the form. Pass.val gives me the value, the string they typed into their password field. And then I'm saying, assuming that login.php is going to echo something back, make sure that I grab that as data. Here I'm making sure that it did send something back, or that it did send something back. And I'm going to say, okay, if the login was successful, we're going to set the login and the error divs to go away. So they're still there on the page when I'm doing my commenting stuff. They're just hiding. And I'm going to then say load page, you successfully logged in. And then otherwise, I make that kind of fancy little slide up thing happen where it says, you're not a wizard, Alex, Bob, Harry, whatever. So here's the behavior for logging in. So actually handing the behavior of the form when I click submit, when I type in some login credentials, either Harry Potter to log in successfully, which is defined by login.php. That's where I specify what a successful login is, right here. So I make sure that the username is Harry, password is Potter. But if it's not, then I tell them, whoever they typed in as their user, that they are not a wizard. I say on the HTML for the error, I set the HTML to invalid login, you're clearly not a wizard, plus whatever the value in the username field is. And then I set the value of the username field to empty, because I don't want to leave whatever they typed in the form. But if I did want to leave whatever they typed in, I would just comment this line out. I'm not going to bother updating the site, but with this line commented out, if they fail to log in, it will still leave Alex in the username box for the next time they go back to the form. So this load page is where we've been headed, right? Logging in is eventually, once you get it right, going to take you to this load page function. So what does load page do? Well, I didn't have time to make it look particularly pretty in terms of how it's like abstracted out and having multiple helper functions. So it's kind of just one big block of text. but we'll go through it kind of chronologically and hopefully fairly quickly, because once you get the notation, reading the code actually should make a lot of sense. So the first thing we do is that we're going to send a GET request. We're going to get comments. So what is get comments doing? Well, this should look somewhat familiar. So we're going to say, OK, go to this page. We're going to execute this SQL. And we're going to say, OK, grab all of the comments in my comments table, order them by ascending timestamp, so from earliest to latest. And then I'm going to execute that. And then I'm going to start an array. So this is just the JSON encoding bit, in which I basically grab each row in the result set of my SQL. So that's nothing new. You have that code already somewhere in your code. And then for all of the entries in that row that I'm getting back, row by row, from the SQL table, I'm storing those in my own array, my own associative array called row array. And then, say that 10 times fast, by the way, row array. And then I'm adding row array to my big outside array, which is going to be, again, for JSON encoding. And then I'm going to JSON encode this whole array, and it ends up looking a certain way, so that basically, back in my JavaScript, I'll be able to say, when I'm iterating through the array that gets returned, so it's going to be called data or data2 or something like that in my anonymous function, that data or data2 is in this case going to be array. And it's going to be encoded a certain way so that I can say data2 bracket bracket like 2 would be the second of the rows. And that second of the rows would have a dot name, which would be the name that came back from that row. So as you can see, when we actually do get around to iterating through what came back, you'll note that it's data, right? I'm calling it data again. So data is coming back, and that's my array that I made and JSON encoded. So I could then iterate through that array right here. I don't do it right away, which is kind of bad, but I basically ask, if nothing came back, then I'm going to set the comments divs HTML to be no comments in the system. And otherwise, kind of by implicit else, I'm going to say, OK, do a simple for loop through data.length. So that's the array that getComments.php gave us back encoded. And then each time, I'm going to call this function. So layer of abstraction making things more confusing. But basically, what I care about is that data I is holding a bunch of associative values. And the values it's holding are an ID, a name, a comment, and a timestamp. So we specify those here. Here, by saying it's going to have an ID, a name, a comment, and a timestamp. And the way that in JavaScript I then reference those fields, those parts of the JSON array that I encoded, are going to be by saying data, whatever thing we're iterating through, whichever data item, because it's an array, whichever data item we're iterating through, grab the ID associated with that item. And again, if this doesn't make sense right now, it's several layers of arrays, and that gets a little confusing, but once you have the code to look at on your own, hopefully it'll make sense. If it were data0.id, that would be the first SQL row that got returned, that first ID of that first comment. So it would be like 1, whereas the second one might be 2. The second one's name might be Alex or might be Bob, stuff like that. So you can go and debug this stuff on your own, but that's basically what's going on. So I'm calling this add new comment function based on the stuff that I grab in my get request. Each thing that I get out of my get request, each row, so each comment really, because each row corresponds to a comment, I'm saying, OK, add new comment. So what is add new comment? That's my way of trying to unclutter it a little bit. So add new comment is fairly short in that it's going to take, as any JavaScript function does, it's going to take a bunch of things, which I'm going to call my ID, my name, my comment, my timestamp. Don't worry about this one too much. I'm just passing the div around. And I'm going to say, OK, if there are no comments, this is something I'm keeping track of under the hood. If there are no comments, we're going to set this to empty because, well, you'll see why, but it's an implementation detail. But basically what we end up doing is we're going to construct a new div. So this is where this whole tangent finally comes back to where I was going, right? We're trying to also, in addition to just traversing the HTML and get various things on the HTML page, like tags, we also want to add our own dynamically through interaction with the page. So how do we tell jQuery that we want to add a div or create a new input or create a new something rather than just get one that's already there? It's really subtle and it'll lead to lots of bugs, but if you put caret brackets around the thing in the double quotes, that creates a new one for you. So instead of just saying new comment div equals div new comment div, that's going to look for a div on the screen that has a new comment div already. But by saying div in caret brackets, that's going to say I'm making a new one. Okay? That's something that you just kind of have to know, that jQuery tutorials will teach you, but it's good to know going in, that that's how you make a new one. And then, given this new div that I've created, I can add a bunch of stuff to this div as I'm making it. So here's where jQuery really flexes its muscles. So here I'm going to say it's going to have an HTML class of comment. So that's for my CSS purposes. I want this to be treated as a comment div, which has its own set of rules like the following stuff, right? So that's where I say add the class comment in the code, right here. It's a jQuery function called add class. Similarly, I'm setting attributes on my new tag, my new div tag, to be the ID of this div is going to be whatever the ID was that came in. So for the second comment, it's going to have an ID of 2 on my actual HTML page so that I can reference them by ID later. That's just, again, something that I'm doing for the code, but that you don't have to set an ID. You can set any attribute that corresponds HTML-wise with a given tag. So if you have an input, you could set the type to text, right? You could have some kind of input. Here's a new input. And you kind of have to assemble it piece by piece, but you would say input dot attribute, and it might be type text, right? That's going to give us a new input. That's going to be a text box. Done. And then we have this input that we can then associate various events off of, all on the fly. So what are we doing here? We're creating a new div, and then with that div, we're setting the HTML of that div, as well as adding some classes for CSS purposes. And our actual comment looks like it's a line break followed by the name, followed by wrote, and a couple more line breaks, followed by double quotes, followed by the comment itself, more line breaks, followed by the timestamp. So that is exactly what we see in one of these comments. We just defined one of these comments, right? Oh crap, I deleted again. Because when you click on our new comment div, I supplied the following function. Here's what you do when you are clicked. So when this individual div are clicked, as I'm creating it, I define the behavior it's going to have for the rest of its life. Kind of on the fly without going through them all after they're created and saying each of you have this behavior. I'm saying as I create you have this behavior. So I'm saying, okay, new comment div, when you are clicked, do the following. So when it is clicked, it's going to post to delete comment. I'm going to tell it which ID I'm clicking, just so that I know SQL-wise what comment to delete in the database. And then I'm not specifying an anonymous function back in this one because I don't care. Delete comment is not going to tell me back anything useful. It doesn't echo anything. It just has to do something as a side effect behind the scenes. It needs to remove something from the database. So after it's removed something from the database, I just assume that it executed correctly, this line of code. I don't check it or anything. I probably should, but I don't. And then I say, okay, new comment div, slide up, go away, disappear. And then I adjust the number of comments because I'm keeping track. And then this is where that num comments comes in useful. If I happen to delete the last one, I want to make sure that the text, no comments in the system at this time, comes back after I delete the last one. So looks like that's not working all the time. But if I refresh, then we see it. But ignore that. You can figure out how to fix that bug on your own. It is a slight bug. OK, so the last thing that we're doing, and which is totally, totally key to jQuery, is that as you're constructing objects that you want to put on the DOM, so divs, inputs, buttons, whatever, as you construct them, as you create them, they don't get attached to anywhere on the page. You have to specify, relative to some other div or some other DOM object, how and where it's going to be attached to the stuff that's already on the HTML page. The way that you do that is via append. So I have a comments div that already exists somewhere else. And where it comes from doesn't really matter, but suffice to say, the comments div is already on the page somewhere. In fact, I think it's right here, isn't it? Oh, no, it's not. Crap. I messed around with that a few times before this. Oh, well, let's just find it. OK, here's where I create the comments div. So I create it with those triangular brackets. I give it an ID of comments, an HTML ID. And then, via passing that around as an actual argument to this add new comment, I'm actually passing that div, which is a little weird because you don't think of passing chunks of HTML like as arguments to functions. You don't really think about it that way, but that's what I'm doing here. It's kind of like passing it by object or by reference rather than by value. Basically, what I end up doing is I say, OK, comments div, append to you new comment div. So this new comment that I just made, make sure that that gets attached and appended at the end of the current comments that are already there. So the next time this gets called, the comments will already have this comment div attached to it for the comment that I just grabbed. So the next comment gets added to after that, and after that, and after that, appending new HTML chunks, new tags to the HTML that it already knows it itself is. I return comments div, don't really worry about that. That's, again, passing by reference kind of thing, and because I didn't really know how to do it otherwise. That was also like me trying to finish this in the last hour before giving the presentation. So at the very end of this for loop, so again, this for loop adds all of the comments that we got back in our getComments.php call, right? GetComments.php gave us back a JSON array of all of our comments from the database. That was data. I go through each of those rows, and given the stuff that I grabbed and that are now in my JSON array, I pass those in, and I create HTML based off of it. Finally, I append my new HTML comment to the thing that's keeping track of all of the comments on my page. And that's coming out as comments div, because I'm saving it after I return. And so what do I do now? Well, I have a page div, and I append my comment form div, which you haven't seen, but which is the form for adding new comments, and which was constructed above, and comments div, which is what I just added the new comment to. So I created a new comment div, I added it to my comments div, and now, because my comments div is itself floating around and not actually attached anywhere on the page, I attach my comments div to page div, which is attached to the page, as you can see. It's right here. It never went away or got created in jQuery. It was just there from the start. So that was kind of my anchor. So I append comments div to page div, and that actually makes all of my comments, or comments div and all of its sub things, appear on the page. So you have to kind of recursively be appending these things so that they cascade out and everything shows up correctly. So the last thing that I do is, while page div was on the page, one of the first things that I did in load page is that I set page div's CSS to display none. So while it's doing all of this stuff and generating the page, you don't see it happening because I set it to be hiding. But all the way down here, after I'm done loading my entire page, I tell it to slide down. So I tell it stop hiding using the slide down animation and show up on the page, given all of the kind of sub divs that you have had appended to you over the course of all of this jQuery code. And that's what happens when we see, I'm going to log out again, when we see me log in. Ready? Slide down, no comments in the system at this time. So this is me now adding a comment via the form. I didn't show you the code for the form because it's kind of gross, but here's Alex. Another comment. I press add comment. This is going to add it to the comments div. It created this div, added it to the comments div, and then it slid down. It didn't slide down very nicely, but that's just jQuery details. If I refresh, now is when we're going to see it loading page. It slides down. It's hard to see because my screen is small right now because of the resolution, but it slides down. So that's the page div sliding down after it's already assembled its own content. OK. I think that I should probably stop there and ask if there are any questions, because I think we've now hit all of the major parts of the jQuery language that you would likely want to be using in your own sites if you use jQuery to do this. So again, it might seem kind of like an info dump right now and a lot of different details that you have to remember, but all of this fancy animation and event handling and things that would otherwise be very difficult are only this much code, which is really not that much. It's a lot of white space. It's a lot of anonymous functions with a lot of padding, and it's not a lot of code for that much behavior and that much like slick web surfing experience-ness. Okay, so questions? Yes?
So at the very end of the load page section, right where you said slowly show it now, that JSON, you're just declaring the JSON content as something called JSON.
So the question is, what is this? So that's an excellent question and a detail that I forgot to touch on, and something that cost me like 30 minutes this morning trying to figure out why something wasn't working. So following that dotted red line up, it looks like that's corresponding with this get call. So turns out I lied to you once again about the number of arguments that these get and posts take. There is one last argument after the anonymous function, which handles whatever you get back. And that last argument is, assuming there is something coming back, is specifying the form in which you're expecting to parse whatever's coming back. So in functions like this, when I do JSON encode this array, well, how is my JavaScript supposed to know to interpret it as JSON? There's no way for it to know that. It could be anything. It could be just a string. But I don't want it to parse it as a string. This is where I forgot to specify something as JSON this morning, as expecting JSON. And so it was giving me like a length of 20 as like the array of data that I was handing back, where it should have just had an array length of 1. And I was like, what's 20? And it ended up being the number of characters in the string that I was returning, because it was treating my JSON string, or what was supposed to be a JSON string, as just a string. And it was counting like bracket, quote, like 1 dot, da 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 da. And it was giving me back 20 characters in that string, when I actually wanted it to treat it as like an associative array encoded in JSON method. So what this is doing, that was kind of more information than you probably wanted, but what this is doing is it's saying, add another argument. So we have a get, here's our first argument, here's my second argument, and it keeps going, and that's my second argument right there, that anonymous function, which it doesn't look like it's all still one function call, but if you think about it, this is my last argument, in which I specify the format via which to parse the data that's coming back by that third argument, the anonymous function. And as you can see, I'm highlighting this parenthesis right now. It's blinking red. So the corresponding parenthesis is this get call. So that's all one get call. That whole function is one get call. And the bulk of it ends up being the anonymous function, the behavior. But that makes sense. But it is very, very easy to write that whole anonymous function and then go test and forget at the very end. Because by the time you reach the end of this code, you've forgotten what you were actually doing. And you just say, OK, that's the end of my anonymous function, done. And it looks like I'm missing a parenthesis, so parenthesis, semicolon. But if you forget the JSON, it won't know how to parse and behave accordingly. So this is the last argument, which is frequently forgotten. Good question. Any other questions? Another.
Just where will the code be posted?
I think it'll be posted on cs50.net, wherever the kind of centralized place for seminars is, that shows the list of all the seminars.
So far it's just saying like video slides, but there will be another link here.
So the question is, so far it just says videos, slides, stuff like that. Yeah, as soon as the seminar is done, I'll be sending my source code and making sure that that is linked to where it currently says. Currently there's probably not even a video link because it's being taped right now. but right with those other links on the seminars page for this seminar, there will be a source code download. And it'll just be everything for this whole site. Though it will require you to supply your own database, and you'll have to make your own. Actually, I'll probably give you guys a SQL dump of my table, so you don't even have to make the table on your own time. But you'll have to supply in common.php your own like table name and table login credentials for like the SQL common PHP stuff. But that's just because I don't want you guys messing around on my table. Okay, other questions? Great. Okay, well, I'll stick around after so that if you have individual questions for like the implementation of your site in particular, you can come up and ask those. But hope this was useful, and I hope that many of you do choose to use jQuery for your final projects. Cool.